Chapter 18 of A Little Girl in Old New York. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Melissa MacArthur of J&M Hannon Media. A Little Girl in Old New York by Amanda Minnie Douglas. Chapter 18 Sundry Dissipations. The schools were all opened again. Hanny wasn't too big to go to Mrs. Craven's. Indeed, her school commenced with some girls 2 or 3 years older. Ben went to work, starting off in the morning with John. Jim felt rather lonely. His best girl had been undeniably snifty to him. Something had happened to her at last. Through a friend, her father had secured a position in the custom house. It was not very high, but it had an exalted sound. And instead of the paltry $500 he earned at the shoe store, the salary was $1,000. They were going to move around in First Avenue. Hanny was sorry that it was a few doors above Mrs. Craven's. If Lily had only gone out of the neighborhood. Of course, she disdained the public school. She was going to Rutgers. She held her head very high as they went back and forth during the removal, and stared at Hanny as if she had never known her. But there were so many things to interest Hanny. Sometimes she read the paper to her father, and it was filled with threats and excitements. In the year before, the independence of Texas had been consented to by Mexico on condition that her separate existence should be maintained. But on the 4th of July, at a convention, the people had accepted some terms offered by the United States and declared for annexation. For fear of a sudden alarm, General Zachary Taylor had been sent with an army of occupation and Commodore Connor with a squadron of naval vessels to the Gulf of Mexico. The talk of war ran high. Then we were in a difficulty with England about some Oregon boundaries. The whole of Oregon or none was the cry. England was given a year's notice that steps would be taken to bring the question to a settlement. Timid people declared that wild land was not worth quarreling about. If you could see an atlas of those days, I think you would be rather surprised. And we are all convinced now that geography is by no means an exact science. The little girl and her father studied it all out. There was big, unwieldy Oregon. There was British America and Russian America. There was Nova Zembla and Spitzbergen. And though there were dreams of an open polar sea, no one was disturbing it. We had a great American desert and some wild lands the other side of the Rocky Mountains. An intrepid young explorer, John Charles Fremont, had discovered an inland sea which he had named Salt Lake, and then gone up to Fort Vancouver on the Columbia River. He had started again now to survey California and Oregon. We thought Kansas and Nebraska very far west in those days, and the Pacific coast was an almost unknown land. We had just ratified a treaty with China, after long obstinacy on their part, and Japan was still the hermit kingdom, and the Mikado an unknown quantity. And so everybody was talking war. But then it was so far away, one didn't really need to be frightened unless we had war with England. There were various other matters that quite disturbed the little girl. It had not seemed strange in the summer to have Dr. Hoffman come and take Margaret out driving, or for an evening walk. But now he began to come on Sunday afternoon and stay to tea. Mrs. Underhill was very chatty and pleasant with him. She had accepted the fact of Margaret's engagement, and to tell the truth, was really proud of it. Already she was beginning to lay by, as people phrased it, regardless of Lindley Murray for her wedding outfit. There were a few choice things of Cousin Lois's that she meant for her. Pieces of muslin came in the house, and were cut up into sheets and pillowcases. They were all to be sewed over seam and hemmed by hand. A year would be none too long in which to get ready. Josie one day said something about Margaret being engaged. Hannie made no reply. She went home in a strange mood. To be sure, Steve had married Dolly, but that was different. How could Margaret leave them all and go away with someone who did not belong to them? She could not understand the mystery. It was as puzzling as Cousin Lois's death. She did not know then it was a mystery even to those who loved, and the poets who wrote about it. Her mother sat by the front basement window sewing. Martha was finishing the ironing and singing, "Oh, how happy are they who their Savior obey, and have laid up their treasure above." Martha had been converted the winter before and joined the Methodist Church in Norfolk Street. The little girl went with her sometimes to the early prayer meeting Sunday evening, for she was enraptured with the singing. But she went to her mother now, standing straight before her with large, earnest eyes. "Mother," with a strange solemnity in her tone, "are you going to let Margaret marry Dr. Hoffman?" "Law, child, how you startled me." Her mother sewed faster than ever. "Why, I don't know as I had much to do with it anyway, and I suppose they'd marry anyhow. When young people fall in love. She had read that in some of the books. It must be different from just loving. "Don't be silly," said her mother, between sharpness and merriment. "Everybody falls in love sooner or later and marries. Almost everybody. And if I had not fallen in love with your father and married him, you mightn't have had so good a one." "Oh, Mother, I'm so glad you did." She flung her arms about her mother's neck and kissed her so rapturously that the tears came to her mother's eyes. Why, she wouldn't have missed the exquisite joy of having this little girl for all the world. "There, child, don't strangle me," was what she said, in an unsteady voice. "But Dr. Hoffman isn't like Father." "No, dear. And Margaret isn't like me now. They are young, and maybe when they have been married a good many years, they will be just as happy, growing old together. And since Margaret loves him, and he loves her, why, we're all delighted with Dolly. She's just another daughter. But we have a good many sons," said the little girl, without seeing the humor of it. "Yes, we didn't really need him, just yet. But he's Joe's dear friend, and a nice young man, and your father is satisfied. It's the way of the world. Little girls can't understand it very well, but they always do when they're grown up. There, go hang up your bonnet, and then you may set the table." Yes, it was a great mystery. Margaret seemed suddenly set apart, made sacred in some way. Hannie's intensity of thought had no experience to shape or restrain it. All the girls had liked Charles. Perhaps if there had been several boys and spasms of jealousy between the girls, she might have been roused to a more correct idea. But though they had made him the father, a lover had been quite outside of their simple category. Margaret came down presently. She had on her pretty brown merino, trimmed with bands of scarlet velvet, and at her throat a white bow just edged with scarlet. Her front hair was curled in ringlets. "Mother, can't we have supper quite soon? Or can't I? The concert begins at 7:30, and we want to be there early and get a good seat. Dr. Hoffman is coming at 6:30. Father came in. Mrs. Underhill jumped up and brought in the tea. Jim came whistling down the area steps. They did not need to wait for John and Benny Frank. Hannie looked at her sister, quite as if she were a new person, with some solemn distinction. How had she come to love Dr. Hoffman? She had not settled it when she went to bed alone. There was a dreary feeling now of years and years without Margaret. That was Friday, and the following Sunday, Dr. Hoffman marched into the parlor with a vital at-home step. Margaret was upstairs. Hanny sat in her little rocker, reading her Sunday school book. He smiled and came over to her, took away her book, and clasping both hands drew her up, seated himself and her on his knee before she could make any resistance. "Hanny," he began, "do you know why you're going to be my little sister? I can't remember when I had a little sister. Mine always seemed big to me, and I am very glad to have you. You are such a sweet, dear little girl. Won't you give me a word of welcome?" Something in his voice touched her. "I wasn't glad on Friday," she said slowly. "I don't want Margaret to go away." "Then you will have to take me in here." "There's Stephen's room," she suggested naively. "Yes, that would do. But I'm not going to take Margaret away in a long, long time." "Oh!" She was greatly relieved. "But I want you to love me." And he gave her a squeeze, wondering how she could have kept so deliciously innocent. "Won't you try? You will make Margaret ever so much happier. We should be sad if you didn't love us. And now if you love one, you must love the other." Then Margaret came down, and she said the same thing. So what could Hanny do but promise? And it seemed not to disturb anyone else. When she spoke of the prospect to her father, he said with a laugh and a hug, "Well, I have my little girl yet." Dolly and Stephen took possession of their new abode and had a housewarming. A great, big, splendid party, almost as grand as the wedding. And what a beautiful house it was. There was a bathroom, and marble basins, and gas in every room, and pretty light carpets with flowers and green leaves all over them. There was music and dancing, and a supper. And old Mr. Beekman walked around with her and told her KatieChen wasn't well at all, and he was afraid he should lose her. Dolly said she was to come up on Friday after school and stay until Monday morning. Would Margaret and Dr. Hoffman have a house like this sometime? She had more lessons to learn now, and grammar was curiously associated with Mrs. Murray being so sweet and attentive to the British officers while the Federal soldiers stole along. She could fairly see them with her vivid imagination. History began to unfold the great world before her. Another thing interested her, and this was that every pleasant day Daisy Jasper came to school for the morning session. She was very backward, of course, for she had never been to school at all. She could walk now without her crutch, but Sam was always very careful of her. The Jasper house became the rendezvous for the girls, as the Deans had been. Even Bonnie Prince Charlie was allowed to go there. Daisy loved to see them dance to the music of her wonderful box. But Charles had not been able to buy his accordion. He needed a new suit of clothes if he had any money to throw away, and Mrs. Reed insisted that should be put in the bank when his father said he could buy him all the clothes he needed. Some of the girls at school were making pretty things for a fair to be held in the basement of the Church of the Epiphany in Stanton Street, and they begged Hanny to help. They were to have a fair at Martha's church also, and the little fingers flew merrily. Hanny had found a new accomplishment, and she was very proud to bring it into the school. This was crocheting. Next door to the stable in Houston Street lived a very tidy German family with a host of little children. The man did cobbling, mending boots and shoes. His wife did shoe binding and stitching leather, foxings on cloth tops for gaiters. Button shoes had not come in. They either laced in front or at the side. And very few ladies wore anything higher than the spring heel, as it was called. To be sure, some of them did wear foolishly thin shoes, but there were rubbers unless you disdained them. And they were real India rubber, and no mistake, rather clumsy oftentimes, but they lasted 2 or 3 years. The little German girls, Lena and Gretchen, took care of the babies and did the work. It seemed to Hanny they were always busy. Lena knit stockings and mittens and caps, and her small fingers flew like birds. One day, she was doing something very beautiful with pink zephyr and an ivory needle with a tiny hook at the end. "Oh, what is it?" cried Hanny eagerly. "Lace. Crocheted lace. A lady on Grand Street will give me 10 cents a yard. It is for babies' petticoats, and you can make caps and hoods and fascinators. It plagued me a little at first, but now I can do it so fast, much faster than knitting it, and I am to have all the work I can do." "Oh, if I could learn," cried Hanny. "I'll show you, because you are so good to us. Your boy brought Mother such a package of clothes. But I am not going to teach the girls around here. They will be wanting to do it for the stores. You can make lace with cotton thread, and oh, elegant with silk. That is worth a good deal." Hanny bought her needle and worsted. At first, she was bothered as well. But she was an ingenious little girl, and when you once had the knack, there were such infinite varieties to it. And oh, it was so fascinating. She hardly had time to study her lessons, and one day she did actually miss in her definitions. But she begged Mrs. Craven to let her study them over and recite after school, for she knew her father would feel badly about the imperfect mark. When she had made 2 yards of beautiful pink lace, she showed it to Margaret. She meant to make 2 yards of blue and give them both to Katie Rhodes for her table at the fair. Margaret was very much pleased and said she must learn herself. Daisy Jasper did a little too. She was learning very rapidly and had a wonderful genius for drawing. Oh dear, how busy they were! They were happy and interested, and almost forgot to take out their dolls or read their storybooks. Martha said, "You might do something for my fair, too." And Margaret promised. Jim did feel a little sore that Lily Ludlow did not ask him to her party, which was quite a grand affair. She announced that she had broken with the public school crowd and was going to have all new friends. But the very next week, she met Jim at another party, and he was so handsome and manly that she really regretted her haste. Jim was very proud and dignified, and never once danced with her, nor chose her in any of the games. Dolly and Stephen came home to the Thanksgiving dinner. If Hanny had not been so much engrossed, she might have considered herself left out of some things. Only her father never left her out. And Ben brought home such tempting books that she did wish she could sit up like the others and not have to go to bed at 9. The Epiphany Fair came first, the week before Christmas. The Sunday school room was all dressed with greens, and tables arranged over the tops of the seats with long boards, covered with white cloths. And oh, the lovely articles! Everything it seemed that fingers could make, useful or ornamental, from handsomely dressed dolls to pincushions. From white aprons with lace and ribbon bows on the dainty pockets down to unromantic holders. Everybody laughed and chatted and were as gay could be. in the back room that was rented out for a day school. Indeed, the little girl had come quite near being sent here. There were tables for refreshments. The coffee and tea had a delightful fragrance, and the different dishes looked wonderfully tempting. It was Hanny's first fair, but people didn't expect to take children out everywhere then, or indeed to go themselves. There was more home life, real family life. Her father was her escort, and her mother had said, "Now don't make the child sick by feeding her all kinds of trash, or she can't go out again this winter." So, you see, they had to be careful. But they had some delightful cake and cream, and he bought her a pound of candy tied up in a pretty box, and the loveliest little work basket with a row of blue silk pockets around the inside. Katie Rhodes was waiting at a table with her mother, but she found an opportunity to whisper to Hanny that her lace had sold the very first thing, and there had been such a call for it, she just wished they had had 100 yards. That pleased the child very much. It was like a store, said Hanny to her mother, only everybody seemed to know everybody, and there were all kinds of things. So many people came for their suppers. They must have made lots of money. And I'm as tired as I can be. Only it was beautiful. Martha's church was to have their Christmas Sunday school anniversary, and Charles Reed was to sing a solo with a chorus of 4 voices. The deans and half the people in the street went. Margaret and Dr. Hoffman, and this time John and Ben, took the little girl. Mother had been up at Steve's all day. There was a large platform at the end of the church, and crowds of pretty children dressed in white ranged in tiers, one above another. After a prayer and singing by the congregation, the real exercises began. The body of children sang some beautiful hymns. Then there were several spirited dialogues and separate pieces, very well rendered indeed. When it came Bonnie Prince Charlie's turn, he seemed to hesitate a moment. Hanny thought she would be frightened to death before all the people. I think Charles would have been a year ago. The piano began the soft accompaniment. After the first few notes, the sweet young voice swelled out like the warble of a bird. People were silent with surprise and admiration. The fair, boyish face and slim figure looked smaller there on the platform. The face had a youthful sweetness that nowadays would be pronounced artistic. The chorus came in beautifully. There were 3 verses in the solo, and really, I do not know as the audience were to blame for applauding. The boy had to come out and sing again. This time, a pretty Christmas carol that they had practiced at singing school. When the exercises were finished, the children were all taken downstairs, and they looked very pretty flitting about. There was another surprise, one that greatly interested the little girl. In one prettily arranged booth were 2 curious small beings who had a history. They had already been in Sunday school on 2 occasions. A missionary to China, seeing these little girls about to be sold, had rescued them by buying them himself. He had brought them back on his return, and now kindly disposed people were making up a sum to provide them with a home and educate them. Hanny pressed forward, holding John's hand tightly. They were so strange-looking. The larger and older one was not at all pretty, but the younger one had a sweet sort of shyness and was not so stolid. Their yellow-brown skins, oblique dark eyes, black brows, and black hair done up in a remarkable fashion with some long pins, and their Chinese attire seemed very curious. The gentleman with them said there were hundreds of little girls sold in China, and that women bought them for future wives for their sons. and treated them like bond slaves. These children's feet had not been cramped. This was done mainly to the higher orders. He had some Chinese shoes worn by grown women, and they were such short, queer things, like some of the pincushions made for the fair. We didn't suppose then the Chinese would come and live with us and have a Chinatown in the heart of the city, do our laundry work, and take possession of our kitchens, that the blue shirts and queer-pointed shoes would be a common sight in our streets. So the Chinese children were a curiosity. Indeed, several years elapsed before Hanny saw another inhabitant of the Flowery Kingdom. "Don't you want to put something in the box?" John held out a quarter to the little girl. Her eyes sparkled with pleasure. Then she shook hands with the small Chinese maidens, and she felt almost as if she had been to a foreign country. If Mrs. Reed had been present, she would have marched Charles home in short order. She did not believe in praising children, or anybody else for that matter. Everybody, in her opinion, needed a strict hand. She hardly approved of the singing school, and if she had really understood that Charles would stand out alone facing the audience, and then be applauded for what he had done, and go into the fair and be praised and treated, she would have been horrified and put him on the strictest sort of discipline for the next month. Charles had endeavored to persuade his mother to go, but she wanted to get the turkey ready for the Christmas dinner, and had no time for such trifling things. No woman had who did her duty by her house and her family. The harder and stonier and more rigid the discipline was, the more virtue it contained, she thought. There was no especial end in view with her. It was the way all along that one had to be careful about and make as rough as possible. Mr. Reed was secretly proud of his boy. He had a misgiving that all this praise and attention was not a good thing, but the boy looked so happy, and it was Christmas Eve, with the general feeling of joy in the air. He was curiously moved himself. Perhaps happiness wasn't such a weak and sinful thing after all. It did not seem to ruin the Underhill family. But he said to Charles as they were nearing home, "I wouldn't make much fuss about the evening. Your mother thinks such things rather foolish." They all returned in a crowd, laughing and talking, and saying merry good nights. Martha had the key of the basement, and they trooped in. Indeed, Martha was so much one of the family that Dr. Hoffman paid her a deal of respect. Father was upstairs in the sitting room, reading his paper. He glanced up and nodded. "Oh!" cried Hanny. "Where's Mother?" The house looked so dark and dull, and not a bit Christmassy. It was all so splendid. And oh, Father! Charles sung like an angel, didn't he, Margaret? They made him sing over again, and he looked really beautiful. And there were 2 Chinese girls at the fair, such queer little things. She flushed, for the word recalled Lily Ludlow. Their hands were as soft as silk, and when they talked, well, you can't imagine it. It sounded like knocking little blocks all around and making the corners click. But where is Mother? Mother is going to stay up to Steve's all night. They wanted her to help them. Oh, dear, it won't be any Christmas without her, cried the little girl ruefully. Oh, she'll be home in the morning, likely. Hanny, it is after 11, and you must go to bed, said Margaret. I'd just like to stay up all night once. And can't I hang up my stocking? I'll see to that. Come, dear. And boys, go to bed. End of Chapter 18. Recording by Melissa MacArthur of J&M Hannon Media.
Chapter 19 of A Little Girl in Old New York. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christina Maria Wendt. A Little Girl in Old New York by Amanda Minnie Douglas. Chapter 19. The boys tried to be merry with a big M to it on Christmas morning, but something was lacking. The stockings hung in a row, and there were piles of gifts below them. Books and books and books! They were all too old for playthings now. Hanny had 2 white aprons ruffled all around, and a pretty pair of winter boots. They were beginning to make them higher in the ankle and more dainty, and stitching them in colors. These were done with 2 rows of white. She had a set of the Lucy books that all little girls were delighted with. Oh, I do wonder what they would have said to Miss Alcott and Susan Coolidge and Pansy! But they were very happy in what they had. Jim was delighted with 2 new volumes of Cooper. Ben had a splendid pair of high boots, and 3 new shirts Margaret and the little girl had made for him. But, oh dear, what was it all without Mother? They missed her bright, cheery voice, her smile, and her ample person that had a warm, buoyant atmosphere. They would have been glad to hear her scold a little about the litter of gifts around, and their lagging so when breakfast was ready. To make the little girl laugh, her father told her that once a man was driving along a country road when he saw 7 children sitting on the doorstep crying, and 7 more on the fence. Startled at so much grief, he paused to inquire what had happened, and with one voice they answered, "Our mother's gone away and left us all alone. There's only 7 of us with Martha, and I am not crying," said the little girl spiritedly. Joe dropped in just as they were seated at the table, and whispered something to his father and Margaret. He seemed very merry, and Mr. Underhill gave him a satisfied nod. He brought Margaret a beautiful cameo brooch, which was considered a fine thing then, and put a pretty garnet ring on Hanny's finger. Hanny guessed what the word had been. Mother was going to bring Steve and Dolly down to dinner. Dolly had changed her mind, for she had said she could not come. That was what they were smiling about. At 10, Stephen brought Mother down in the sleigh, and they were more mysterious than ever. Peggy and the little girl must bundle up and go back with him, for he had such a wonderful Christmas present to show them. "But why didn't you bring Dolly and stay to dinner? And oh, Mother, Christmas morning wasn't splendid at all without you," said the little girl, clinging to her. Mrs. Underhill stooped and kissed her and said in a full, tremulous sort of voice, "Run and get your hood, dear, and don't keep Stephen waiting." The horses tossed their heads and whinnied as if they too said, "Don't keep us waiting." The sun was shining, and all the air seemed infused with joy, though it was a sharp winter day. The weather knew its business 50 years ago and didn't sandwich whiffs of spring between snowbanks. And the children were blowing on tin and wooden horns and wishing everybody Merry Christmas as they ran around with the reddest of cheeks. Steve took Hanny on his lap. What did make him so laughing and mysterious? He insisted that Hanny should guess, and then kept saying, "Oh, you're cold, cold, cold as an ice house. You should have put on your guessing cap," and the little girl felt quite teased. They stopped downstairs to get good and warm and take off their wraps. Then Stephen led them up to the front room. It was a kind of library and sitting room, but no one was there. In the window stood a beautiful vase of flowers. Hanny ran over to that. Roses at Christmas-tide were rare indeed. "Here," said Stephen, catching her arm gently. She turned to the opposite corner. There was an old-fashioned mahogany cradle, black with age, and polished until it shone like glass. It was lined overhead with soft light blue silk, and had lying across it a satin coverlet that had grown creamy with age, full of embroidered flowers, dull and soft with their many years of bloom. On the pillow lay her brother's Christmas gift that had come while the bells were still ringing out their message first heard on the plains of Judea. "Oh!" with a soft wandering cry. She knelt beside the cradle that had come from Holland a century and a half ago, and held many a Beekman baby. A strange little face with a tinge of redness in it, a round, broad forehead with a mistiness of golden fuzz, a pretty dimpled chin, and a mouth almost as round as a cherry. Just at that instant he opened the bluest of eyes, stared at Hanny with a grave aspect, tried to put his fist into his mouth, and with a soft little sound dropped to sleep again. A wordless sense of delight and mystery stole over the little girl. She seemed lifted up to heaven's very gates. She reached out her hand and touched the little velvet fist, not much larger than her doll's. But oh, it had the exquisite inspiration of life, and she felt the wonderful thrill to her very heart. Something given to them all that could love back when its time of loving came, when it knew of the fond hearts awaiting the sweetness of affection. "That's my little boy," said Stephen, with the great pride and joy of fatherhood. "Dolly's and all of ours. Isn't it a Christmas worth having?" "Oh!" she said again with the wordless delight in her heart, while her eyes were filled with tears, so deeply had the consciousness moved her. There was a sort of poetical pathos in the little girl, sacred to love. She had never known of any babies in the family, save Cousin Reddy's, and that had not appealed with this delicious nearness. Stephen bent over and kissed her. Margaret came to look at the baby. "He's a fine fellow," said the new father. "We wanted to surprise you," looking at Hanny and smiling. "We made Joe promise not to tell you. And now you are all aunts and uncles, and we have a grandmother of our very own." "Oh!" This time Hanny laughed softly. There were no words expressive enough. "And now you will have to knit him some little boots, and save your money to buy him Christmas gifts." "And what's that new work?" "Crochet him a cap. Dear me, how hard you will have to work." There were such lovely little boots at Epiphany Fair. If I only had known, but I'm quite sure I can learn to make them, her eyes lighting with anticipation. "Oh, when will he be big enough to hold?" "In a month or so. You will have to come up on Saturdays and take care of him." "Can I? That will be just splendid." He was silent. He could not tease the little girl in the sacredness of her new all-pervading love. The nurse entered. She had a soft white kerchief pinned about her shoulders, and side puffs of hair done over little combs. She nodded to Margaret and said, the baby was a very fine child, and that Mrs. Underhill was sleeping restfully. They had been so glad to have Mr. Underhill's mother. Then she patted the blanket over the baby and said it had been worked for his great-great-grandmother, and they put it over every Beekman baby for good luck. Margaret declared they must return. Mother was tired, and the Archers were coming up to dinner after church. "Could I kiss it just once?" asked Hanny timidly. "Oh, yes," the nurse smiled and turned down the blanket, and the baby opened his eyes. Hanny felt that in some mysterious manner he knew she loved him. Her lips touched the soft little cheek, the tiny hands. "He's very good now," said the nurse, "but he can cry tremendously. He has strong lungs." Stephen took them back and then went down to Father Beekman's. There was so much to do. The little girl and the big girl were both busy enough helping Mother. The boys and her father had gone out, but they had all heard the wonderful tidings. Hanny ran back and forth waiting on Martha and carrying dishes to the table, so there would be no flurry at the last. "Hello, Aunt Hanny," laughed Jim, bouncing in with the reddest of cheeks. "You'll have to grow fast now to keep up with your dignity." "Well, is he Beekman Dutch or Underhill English?" "He's just lovely. His eyes are blue as the sky." "Hurrah for Steve!" Well, that was a Christmas. Her father was coming with the two cousins, and she ran upstairs to wish them Merry Christmas and tell her father what she thought of the baby. The baby and the Christmas sermon and the rheumatism and cold weather seemed to get jumbled all together, and for a little while everybody talked. Then John and Joe made their appearance, and Martha rang the bell, though the savory odors announced that all was ready. They had a very delightful dinner. Mrs. Underhill had a pretty new consequence about her, and was not a bit teased by being called grandmother. Dolly's advent into the family had been a source of delight, for she fraternized so cordially with every member, and of late she and Mother Underhill had been tenderly intimate, for Mrs. Beekman was kept much at home by her husband's failing health. When they had lingered over the mince pies, which certainly were delicious, and finished their coffee, they went upstairs to chat around the fire. After the dishes were dried, Hanny ran into the Deans to interchange a little Christmas talk, and tell the girls about Stephen's baby. She was so excited that all other gifts seemed of little moment. Daisy Jasper had been confined to the house for a week with a severe cold. "I began to think you had forgotten me," she said as Hanny entered the beautiful parlor, "and Dr. Joe said you had something special to tell me. Oh, what is it?" For the little girl's face was still in a glow of excitement. "I can never have any nieces or nephews because there's only one of me," said Daisy, with a sad little smile. "I almost envy you. If I could have one of your brothers out of them all, I should choose Dr. Joe. He is so tender and sweet and patient. He used to take me in his arms and let me cry when crying wasn't good for me either. I was so miserable and full of pain, and he always understood." Hanny was so moved by pity for Daisy that she almost felt as if she could give him away. She had so much. Not quite, however, for he was very dear to her, and when she looked into Daisy's lovely face and remembered her beautiful name and glanced at the elegant surroundings, it seemed strange there should be anything to wish for. But health outweighed all. Daisy was delighted with the Christmas Eve anniversary, the singing of Bonnie Prince Charlie, the fair, and was wonderfully interested in the little Chinese girls. She meant to send some money toward their education. Mr. Bradbury was to give a concert in February with the best child singers of the different schools. Charles was to take part. His father had promised him that indulgence. "I hope I shall get strong enough to go," began Daisy wistfully. "It is the sitting up straight that tires my back. But last year it was so much worse. Dr. Joe says I shall get well and be almost like other girls. See how much I have gone to school? It is so splendid to learn for your own very self. You don't feel so helpless." Daisy's Christmas had been a beautiful Geneva watch. We had not gone to watchmaking then, and had to depend on our neighbors over the water for many choice articles, and a watch was a rare thing for a little girl to possess. When she went home, Hanny had to get out her pretty new work and show the visitors. She had nearly 4 yards of lovely blue edging she was making for Margaret, but she had not hinted at its destination. "Why," exclaimed Aunt Nancy, "I've seen mittens knit with a hook something like that. Not open work and fancy, but all tight and out of good stout yarn. They're very lasting." "I do believe they're like what Uncle David makes," said John. "Don't you remember? He used to give us a pair now and then." "Well, I declare, there's nothing new under the sun," laughed Aunt Patience. Hanny was quite sure there could not be any connection between her delicate lace and stout yarn mittens, and she meant to ask Uncle David the next time they made a visit. Both ladies praised her a good deal, especially when they heard of the shirt she had been making with Margaret. "It used to be a great thing," said Aunt Patience. "When I was 6 years old, I had knit a pair of stockings by myself, and when I was 8, I had made my father a shirt. All the gussets were stitched, just as you do a bosom. My, what a sight of fine work there was then. I'll tell you something I read the other day in a queer old book I picked up down at the office," began Ben. "When the little Prince Edward was 2 years old, the Princess Elizabeth, who was an afterward queen, made him a shirt or smock, as it was called, with drawn work and embroidery, and she was only 6. "Children have more lessons to study now," said Mrs. Underhill, half in apology. "And Hanny has done some drawn work for me and embroidered some aprons." "And Queen Elizabeth spent enough time later on with gay gallants," remarked Aunt Nancy. "So I do not know as her early industry held out." "I'd rather have her splendid reign than to have made shirts for an army," declared Ben. "Well, we all have our duties in this world," sighed Aunt Patience. "I learned to make shirts, but I never had a husband or boys to make them for." They all laughed at that. But what would a little girl say now if she had to stitch down the middle of a shirt bosom, following a drawn thread, and taking up only 2 threads at every stitch? There certainly was great need of Elias Howe. The visitors declared they must get home by dark. There was the poor cat, and the fires must need looking after. Mrs. Underhill was fain to keep them to tea, but instead packed them up a basket of cold turkey and some delicious boiled ham, a dozen or 2 crullers, and a nice mince pie. John was to see the old ladies home. When they were gone, Hanny went up to the spare room, for in one drawer of the best bureau she kept her beautiful doll, which had never been permanently named. She opened it, and kneeling down, raised the napkin that covered her, as one tucks in a little child. Yes, she was lovely. Really prettier than Stephen's baby, she felt, though she would not say it. But when you came to kiss on the cold wax, that was the test. And Stephen's baby would grow and walk and talk and have cunning little teeth and curly hair, maybe. She did so love curly hair. "Dolly," she began gravely, "I'm going to put you away. I shall be 11 next May, and though I shall always be father's little girl, I shall be growing up and too old to play with dolls. Then I shall have so much to do. And I should love the real live baby best. That would hurt your feelings. Sometime there may be another little girl who will be as glad to have you come on Christmas Day as I was. I shall love you just the same, but you have a different kind of love for something that is human, and can put truly arms around your neck and kiss you. When girls are little, they don't mind the difference so much. You won't feel real lonesome, for dolls don't. We only make believe they do. And now I shall not make believe any more, because I'm getting to know all about real things. There are so many real and strange things in the world that are lovely to think about, and I seem to have learned so much today. I can't feel quite as I did yesterday." She put on the wadded satin cloak and the dainty hood, and laid it back in the box. There was room for the muff and the traveling shawl. She put the cover on softly. She folded the pretty garments and packed them in the corner, and spread the towel over them all. There was no morbid feeling of sacrifice or sense of loss. A great change had come over her. A new human affection had entered her soul. She had a consciousness that could not be put into words. She had outgrown her doll. Margaret was going to an oratorio with Dr. Hoffman. The boys were to attend the Christmas celebration at Allen Street Church with the Deans. Hanny had not cared to go. Her mother kept watching her with a curious feeling, as if she saw or suspected some change in her. The room settled to quiet. The fire burned drowsily. Mrs. Underhill took the big rocking chair at one side, and Hanny came and settled herself on a footstool, leaning her arms on her mother's knee. "I shall not hang up my stocking next Christmas," she said in a soft, slow tone. "It is very nice when you believe in it, and real fun afterward when you don't believe in it but like it, when you seem little to yourself." "You do grow out of it," replied her mother, but at heart she was half sorry. "You get just the same things. At least you get suitable things." Was she glad to have them all growing up? "Dear me, there's no little children," she continued with a sigh. "You'll be 11 next May, Hanny." "But there's Stephen's lovely little baby. Doesn't it seem just as if God had sent him at the right time when we're all growing big?" She took the little girl's hands in hers and said dreamily, "You were sent that way, at the right time. I was so glad to have you. I can recall it so plainly. Old Mother Tappan was there. I was so afraid you'd be a boy, and we had boys enough. And she said, 'Oh, what a nice little girl.' You'll be glad enough, Mrs. Underhill." And so I was. "As glad as Stephen?" said Hanny with shining eyes. "Yes, dear, even if it wasn't Christmas. You were a welcome little May flower." In Bethlehem of Judea, the other child had been born with the mighty significance of a great gift to the world, a gift that made Christmas possible for all time to come. Just how the world was redeemed, no little girl of 10 or so could understand. But it was redeemed because the little child of Bethlehem bore the sins of the whole world in his manhood. Ah, no wonder they wrote under the picture of his mother, when he was gone, "Mater Dolorosa." But the years of his childhood must have been sweet to remember. The young child and his mother, the wise men coming with their gifts, the sweet song going around the world, the great love. Her mother's hands relaxed from their clasp. She was very tired and had fallen asleep. Her father folded his paper and looked over at her wistfully. Hanny came and dropped softly on his knee, and his strong, tender arms enclosed her. Was there any child quite like this little girl? They had been so proud and happy over Stephen, so delighted with Margaret. He had loved them all, and they were a nice household of children. But they were growing up and going their ways. They would be making new homes. Ah, it would be many a long year before the little girl would think of such a thing. They would keep her snug and safe, to have and to hold, and he smiled to himself at the literal rendering. The chime of the clock roused Mrs. Underhill. It was Hanny's bedtime, and she had been so busy all day, so full of excitement, too, that her cheeks had bloomed with roses. She glanced across. The fair flaxen head was on the shoulder, half hidden by the protecting arm. The other head, showing many silver threads now, drooped over a little. The picture brought a mist to her eyes, and there was a half-sob in her throat. The same thought came into her mind. She would be their little girl when the other one had gone to her new home. She could not disturb them. It was goodwill and peace everywhere. End of Chapter 19. Recording by Christina Maria Wendt. End of A Little Girl in Old New York by Amanda Minnie Douglas.